Get this show on the road. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another edition of our water issues seminars. In 2022, the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources started getting reports of low water supply or out of water situations at about 150 private domestic wells in the Blaine-Ham Lake area of Anoka County in Minnesota. This morning we have Amanda Yord with us from the DNR, who's going to tell us about their investigation into this pretty big problem. Amanda is a hydrogeologist in the Groundwater Technical Analysis Unit at the Minnesota DNR, working on groundwater supply issues. Her main focus is protecting drinking water supply and ensuring that there'll be enough water out there for the future and for future generations. Amanda has a bachelor's degree in geology from Carleton College and a master's in hydrogeology with a minor in water resources sciences from the University of Minnesota. Amanda, welcome to our group, and it's great to have you with us. Take it away. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Good morning, everyone. I will be giving a PowerPoint today, so I'm going to try to share my screen here. Yeah, thank you for having me. I think this is mostly an MPCA crowd, I think. So happy to be here. I've come to some of these in the past. They've been really interesting. So just thank you for organizing them and for having them, because it's important to hear what everyone else is doing around the state when it comes to water. So yeah, I'm excited to be here today. And as Mark mentioned, I am going to talk about the DNR well interference investigation in the Blaine-Ham Lake area of Anoka County in Minnesota. And before I start, I should also just say if at any point you can't hear me or I cut out or something, just Mark or someone just jump in and let me know. All right, so before I fully get into the well interference situation and talking about the problem, I wanted to talk a little bit about the DNR Groundwater Technical Unit that I'm a part of, because I think it will give everyone an idea of why we got involved in this situation in Anoka County. So this is a picture of our team here. So our team, basically, we function as groundwater consultants for the regulatory decision makers at DNR, so the people who issue permits. So DNR, we regulate groundwater quantity. So people apply to us for permits to use water appropriation permits. And so if someone who's applying for a DNR permit to use water, if they want to use groundwater in an area with limited aquifers like we have in Western Minnesota, or near a protected groundwater feature like calcareous fen or a trout stream, or in an area where domestic wells or drinking water could be at risk, that's when our team, the Groundwater Technical Unit, that's when we get involved. So we come in and do a little study of the groundwater in the area. So we gather all of the information we can that's existing, and then determine if we need to do additional study like aquifer testing. And then based off of our findings, then we make recommendations to the permit decision makers at DNR about if the proposed use is sustainable or not. So I also wanted to show this picture because this well interference situation that I'm going to talk about is quite large and took a lot of people, and most people in this picture contributed in some way to this project, but I especially want to highlight Jennifer Rose, Rosalind Krogh, and Ellen Considine, because they helped a lot with this. All right, so let's get into the actual story of the well interferences. So I'm going to give away the ending of this project first, so you can keep these things in mind throughout this presentation. So the main takeaway is that pumping by the city of Blaine caused people to run out of water in their private domestic wells in the neighboring city of Ham Lake in 2022. And this happened for two main reasons. The first is just the geology in the area is unique and it leads to a high degree of um, connectivity between aquifers. Aquifers are really connected across large distances. And we'll spend quite a bit of time looking at this cross section later. So we will zoom in on it. And the second reason is that there was just really, really high water use during summer 2022. It was record high water use in the area. We all remember 2022, the drought that's, you know, continuing, has been continuing. So water use was really high from permitted users, which include municipal users and other users, and also from domestic wells, private domestic wells. You know, people use more water from their private wells during dry times, and all of this use really caused low groundwater levels, which led to the well interferences. All right, so let's get into the timeline of what actually happened here. So in August 2022, the DNR began receiving calls from residents of Blaine-Ham Lake, whose private domestic wells, like this one, were suddenly out of water or really low on water. And when this happened, we right away suspected well interference and we started investigating. So a well interference happens when pumping from a high volume user, like this well in the middle, lowers the water level in the surrounding aquifer. So well interference happens when the water level drops below a pump in the domestic well. So you can see the water levels below this pump here. And so the pump can't reach water anymore. So the well will functionally be out of water. And the homeowner who used the domestic well for water supply can't access water from their well anymore. So when we receive a well interference complaint, we follow a particular process to investigate. So first, a well driller has to visit and inspect the homeowner's well to make sure to see if it has any problems. And the well driller and the homeowner work together to submit a well interference complaint form to DNR. And this really kicks off the DNR investigation. So after we receive this form, then we investigate everything we know about the area. And at the end of our investigation, we use all the information we gathered to determine if a complaint is valid, which means that high volume pumping in the area caused the well to run out of water. And if this is the case, if it is valid, that means that whatever high volume user caused the domestic well to go out of water, they are responsible for reimbursing that domestic well owner for any work that they did to restore their water supply. So that can include anything from lowering the pump to completely replacing the well, depending on the situation. So we can also determine that a complaint is not valid. And when we determine this, this means that the well ran out of water for some other reason, like a bad pump, crack in the well casing. So essentially, this process works to preserve drinking water as the first water use priority in Minnesota. And it's a pretty unique process. And there's more about it in rule and statute if you're interested in learning more about it. So all of the well interference complaints that we'll be talking about today are from Anoka County in the North Metro here in this black outlined area. So to date, we have received around 90 well interference complaint forms in this black outlined area. And these are for issues that occurred during 2021, 2022, or 2023. And because there are so many complaints, we are investigating them in batches. So if we zoom in on that black outlined area, this shows 50 complaints that we investigated first. And these complaints were submitted in 2022 for issues that occurred in 2022. And we designated this investigation area to be within 3 miles of these complaints. And so for the rest of this talk, we're going to focus on these 50 complaints shown in green here. All right, so for the next section of the talk, I'm going to walk you through the investigation of these 50 complaints as if we were doing it again, so you can follow along how we piece together this story. So first, we'll talk about the complaint information that we gathered from well drillers and homeowners. Then we'll talk about the geology and dive into that cross-section. We'll look at water level data and water use data in this area, and then we'll finish by talking about the data analysis and modeling that we did to determine who caused these domestic wells to run out of water. So we started by looking at the complaint information in these 50 complaints to look for similarities. And again, this is from well drillers and homeowners, their own description of their problems that they experienced, and then the well drillers' expertise about wells to determine if there were any issues with the wells. And so when we started looking at all these together, we noticed there were a lot of similarities. They all occurred around the same time in late summer. July and August was really the time when most people were having problems. You can see from the map here, they were clustered in southern Ham Lake. Well owners were all reporting the same issues, either completely out of water or very low water supply, intermittent water supply. And the issues got resolved for the vast majority of wells by just lowering pumps. So it wasn't an issue that an issue of the wells being too shallow. It was the pumps were too shallow. There was enough depth in most of the wells for the pumps to be lowered. We actually only had one well that needed to be replaced out of these 50. The rest got access to water by just lowering pumps. So this is an interesting one. We noticed that domestic wells had a similar magnitude of drawdown between the water level that was recorded on the well log from the time the well was installed compared to the water level recorded at the time of the complaint. So that means water levels dropped about 30 feet between the well being installed to summer 2022. And that was like pretty consistent across this area. And so all of these similarities told us this couldn't just randomly happen out of nowhere. This really told us that there was something causing this. So there must have been some high volume pumping nearby. So we looked at who is pumping during this time. So we have 21 permitted groundwater users in this area, and these are shown in these gray squares here. And these users have permits from the DNR to use groundwater for things like golf course irrigation, sod farm irrigation, private water supply, athletic field irrigation. And these permits are associated with 38 wells, so some permits have more than one well. Now, municipal supply is also a big water use in this area. So the pink areas show where the city of Blaine has 2 well fields that they use for municipal supply. And at this time, we found out that the city of Blaine was pumping from their east well field. This is a newly constructed well field without a permit from DNR. So we were not aware these that these wells were pumping, before this time. So you're probably wondering, you may be wondering why these complaints are clustered in Ham Lake and not Blaine. And there are 2 reasons for that. The first is that Ham Lake does not have a municipal supply. And so everyone in Ham Lake relies on domestic wells for drinking water. There's no city water. Um, and the second is that they chose to resolve most of the well interference complaints they received within their city limits before we investigated. And so they just reimbursed homeowners, before even the homeowners got a chance to submit complaints to DNR. So our focus was on Ham Lake. All right, so if we go back to complaint information, one thing that I didn't mention before when I was talking about this is that domestic wells that had issues um, were all a similar depth. They were all around 100 to 300 feet, and they were usually on the deeper side of this end, like greater than 200 feet. So this should make all the geologists perk up because it tells us that there is something going on at that depth under the ground in this area. So our next step was to look at the geology. So in the next slide, I'm going to show a cross section across this line here. So this will be just south of the complaints. So here's our cross section, and this was created by the DNR County Geologic Atlas and MGS as well. So this cross section is from west to east, and for reference, this is Lexington Avenue. So if we go back, Lexington Avenue is right here. So most of the complaints were occurring in this area right here. And so as I go through this cross section, kind of focus on this middle part of the cross section. So there's a lot going on here. So we'll start at the top and work our way down. So the first aquifer shown in pink is the water table aquifer. And you can see this aquifer is pretty ubiquitous in the area because it occurs in the Anoka sand plain. And the water table aquifer is not highly used for high capacity pumping. And it's used some for domestic supply, but not a lot. If we keep going down, below the water table, we have our glacial confined aquifers. And these are the aquifers that you can see in blue and green here. And everything that you see in gray is clay or till. The darker the gray it is, the more clay, the tighter it is. So you can see that the glacial confined aquifers are not as ubiquitous as the water table aquifers. In some areas, like these bedrock valleys, the aquifers are really quite thick. And in some areas, they just don't really exist at all, or they're really small and patchy. But we found that a lot of domestic wells and high capacity wells use water from these buried glacial aquifers. And in some areas, these aquifers are closely connected to the water table, and some areas not. So for example, in areas where the clay is really thin, then there would be like a greater connection here than in areas where the clay is really thick. So it depends on the geology. So below the glacial confined aquifers, we have the bedrock aquifers, and these are shown, everything that's in blue. So these in blue are bedrock aquifers, and they're under this black line here. So this thick hashed line that I put on here is the erosional bedrock surface. So this surface was eroded over millions of years, and then glacial sediment was deposited on top of this. And this bedrock surface is really, really important to this investigation because it is highly fractured in the top 50 feet, which I have highlighted here in blue. And because it's highly fractured in this top 50 feet, it means that groundwater flows really well through this upper 50 feet, regardless of what bedrock unit it's in, whether the bedrock is considered an aquifer or an aquitard. So for example, the St. Lawrence Formation, which is shown right here, is normally considered to be a confining unit or an aquitard. But if it occurs within this top 50 feet, it's considered an aquifer. Like water will travel through it, and that's because of all that weathering and the fractures that have happened at this surface. I also want to highlight the Tunnel City aquifer. So this is the one shown in this hash here. The Tunnel City aquifer is the most common or the most prevalent aquifer at the erosional bedrock surface, especially in this area where the well interferences were occurring. So we found that most of the high capacity wells in the area use water from this upper 50 feet of bedrock, and most include the Tunnel City aquifer where it's present. So this includes wells that are open to multiple bedrock units. So there are some wells that are open from the Tunnel City all the way down to the Mount Simon, but um, if there are multi-aquifer wells, they are often open to that top 50 feet and that and the Tunnel City where it's present. So we also found that the domestic wells, we investigated, many of them used water just from the very, very top of this bedrock surface. They didn't go in very deep to the bedrock, but they were often open to the very top of this bedrock. So when we looked at the geology altogether with the water level data and aquifer test data that we have nearby, we found that the shallow bedrock and these glacial confined aquifers are actually connected in this area. So we called this the deep confined shallow bedrock aquifer system. So you can see that some of these glacial aquifers are directly in contact with bedrock in these bedrock valleys here. Um, and when we started thinking about the geology as a flow system rather than specific aquifers, when we stopped thinking about like, oh, Tunnel City or glacial confined and really thought of them as together, operating as a flow system, then we realized that all of the domestic wells and the majority of the high capacity wells in the investigation area used water from this system. So the most domestic wells that had issues were using water from right here, either the very top of the bedrock or some of these smaller glacial aquifers. And the highest capacity pumping from the city of Blaine was happening in this area, these bedrock valleys. So the deep confined aquifers here in this shallow bedrock as well. And these two circles are showing the Blaine West and East well field that I showed in the map earlier. So again, aquifer testing has shown that this blue zone, this blue aquifer system is not super well connected to the water table system or the deeper bedrock system. And so after learning all of this, we really started to focus on this system because we realized that water from this aquifer system is really what sustains the people who live in this area and the businesses in this area who use water. So this is like the workhorse of the area, this zone shown here in blue. So now that we had our aquifer system in our head, the next step was to look at the correlation between water levels and water use in the area. And we started by looking at long-term, going back to the 80s. So I will walk through everything on this graph here. So on the bottom, we have time from starting in 1988 through 2022. We have elevation here, and this will show our groundwater levels in the area. And then over here, we have water use, annual water use in billions of gallons. So let's start with the water levels at the top of the graph. So this hydrograph shows water levels from the deep confined shallow bedrock system. So that blue zone, these water levels are all from that system. We have the Tunnel City. So this is a bedrock well here in green, and then the blue and the pink are glacial confined wells. So these wells are almost 10 miles apart. They're all in the investigation area, but they're almost 10 miles apart. But you can see they're showing really very, very similar trends, which again shows you that this these aquifers are really acting as a system. Another thing you can see with these water levels over time is that they are impacted by pumping. The decreases that you see every year, that is pumping during the summer. And you can see historically water levels have gone down in the summer and then, for the most part, recovered after the high water use period to the pre-pumping levels. And so this up and down pattern has been happening for quite a while. But if you look at recent years, starting in around 2020, water levels have decreased, but then they haven't quite recovered to where they were. And so every year they're decreasing a bit more, but then not recovering fully, decreasing more, not recovering fully. And that is how sustained groundwater level decline happens in aquifers. So what that means is basically more water is being pumped out of the aquifer than is going back into the aquifer. And another thing that you will notice here in 2022, we had the lowest groundwater levels on record in all of these wells on this graph. Even the Tunnel City well, this green one up here, you can't quite see it, but it is the lowest water level on record during 2022. So when we look at water use records down here on the bottom, we can see that water use is increasing over time, and this increased use is due to the city of Blaine. So the city of Blaine water use is shown in these polka dot darker gray bars, and their unpermitted water use in their east well field is shown in the pink, and then all other users is shown in the gray. So when you look at everything together, water use is increasing over time, but that water use for the other users who aren't Blaine, that use is pretty steady, but it's really the city of Blaine's water use that has been increasing. And we can also see, starting in 2021 and continuing into 2022, that the unpermitted water use from the city of Blaine was happening. So when you look at 2022, we see that there was record high water use in the area, about 2 billion gallons used. And this coincides with the record low water levels. So this shows us that on a big long-term scale, water use is connected to water levels. So high water use means lower water levels, and that's really important to show in a well interference investigation. So after we looked at the big picture long-term view, then we zoomed in to look at more recent data from 2021 and 2022. And I'll walk through this graph as well. So on the top, we have the number of complaints that we received over time. So this is just 2021 through 2022 here. These are the number of complaints that were submitted. On the right here, again, we have the groundwater levels from wells in the area, and on the bottom, it's the same water use graph, except it's showing monthly water use rather than annual. So this is broken down by the month. So if we look at the water levels here, there are a lot of wells here, and it's all of these wells, again, are part of that blue zone aquifer system that we're focused on. So don't get too caught up on all the different wells. The main takeaway from this is that all the wells are doing the exact same thing. They're all following the same trend. And even these black dots that you see here, these are water level measurements from domestic wells that reported well interference. And so you can see the domestic wells that had issues are following the same trends as the other wells in the area. And when we look at water use, again, we see water use in the summer really increases. July and August are really high water use years. And again, you can see that water use from that east well field by Blaine was high during summer of 2022. Now, another note on water use, we also know anecdotally that people were using more water from domestic wells in Ham Lake. And we know that because when people would call us to complain that their well was running out of water, they would often say, I was irrigating my lawn and suddenly there was no water in the house, or my irrigation system suddenly stopped working. And so that's how they that was an indication to them that they were out of water. Um, and so just in general, water use was high during the summer, both showing from the data that we have here and from the anecdotal data from Ham Lake. So, but when you take this graph together and look at everything, um, you can see that the high water use in the summer correlates with the low water levels, and this is when people were having problems. So it all lines up here, right? And so that was another really important thing to show, just like the correlation between timing, water use, water levels, and complaints. All right, so now that we knew that high volume pumping in the area had lowered water levels, including in domestic wells, because we were able to show that, our next step was to figure out which of the high volume users were responsible for well interference. And this was the hard part because there are a lot of users in this area. So we started off again with these 38 high capacity wells associated with 21 permits. And again, these are shown in gray. So half of these wells were excluded from the investigation right up front for various reasons that I'll go through now. So to start off, 2 were excluded due to a Minnesota rule, which says that if a high volume well, like this one on the map there, is permitted before a domestic well is installed, then the high volume well cannot be responsible for the interference. So we had 2 high volume wells that were installed before all the domestic wells were installed. So they were just entirely excluded from the investigation. We also had 6 high capacity wells that were not in our deep bedrock shallow or deep confined shallow bedrock aquifer system. They weren't in that blue zone aquifer system, and so we took them out. They were either in the water table or deeper aquifers, so they were not included. There were 9 wells that used less than 250,000 gallons in 2022, and we showed that using that small amount of water did not, really cause enough drawdown to be an issue. And similarly, there were 2 that had a pumping rate of less than 100 gallons per minute. And we also showed that that pump rate was not high enough to cause the issues that we were seeing. And so that left us with 19 high capacity wells remaining. So we narrowed it down to 19. So then we were like, okay, let's figure out which one of these 19 caused domestic wells to run out of water. So to do this, we used a predictive analytical model in Octosolve to try to recreate pumping and water level decline in 2022. So to make our model, we had to try to find a way to recreate what happened in 2022 over this fairly large area. And we also had to treat this entire blue section of the aquifer together as one, because we knew that it was all connected. And because we knew it all was connected, we wanted to keep it really simple. So we used an aquifer thickness of 100 feet because the average thickness of a glacial aquifer was about 50 feet. And then we had that upper 50 feet of the bedrock aquifer. And so put those together, that's 100 feet. We got aquifer parameters from aquifer tests and literature values nearby. And so we ended up using a hydraulic conductivity of 117 feet per day, and we just used the same parameters for that whole aquifer. So you can see that this was very broad brush. We kind of were just like lumping things together, looking at a really big scale, keeping it really simple. But when we simulated pumping from the 19 high capacity wells that we investigated, our modeled drawdown was within about 10 feet of our observed drawdown. And So that really just showed us uh, that the model, like considering how broad brush it was, fit decently well, which I think is a testament to how connected everything is in the area. Um, so we use these parameters to model the drawdown that would happen from pumping each of the 19 wells at the 2022 rates and volumes. So if the model showed that pumping from a high volume well caused at least 1 foot of drawdown in a domestic well, then that high volume well would be um, considered responsible or a contributor to well interference. So let's look at this again in like a map view, like in a cartoon form. So say we have a high capacity well right here, and these two blue dots are domestic wells. So we do the model and we figure out that this high capacity well causes more than 1 foot of drawdown within this circle, this 1 foot area of influence, we were calling it. So that means that this well contributed to well interference in these two domestic wells. So obviously we had more high capacity wells that we investigated. So if we add another one here, this is another high capacity well. This well used more water, so it has a bigger, it caused more drawdown, so it has a bigger 1 foot drawdown area of influence. So this pink well would be responsible for well interference in this domestic well, but not this one. And so this domestic well had two contributors to well interference, the blue and the pink. And this domestic well had one contributor to well interference, the blue. So this is just an example to kind of show you how we did this. So we followed this process for each of the 19 high capacity wells and the 50 domestic wells investigated. We literally just put them all on a map. We had a bunch of circles on the map to figure out who contributed to which well interference. So using this method, here's what we found. Of the 50 complaints that were investigated, we found that 47 were valid and 3 were not valid. So the 3 that were not valid, we found that they ran out of water for some other reason, like a bad pressure tank, that their issues were not related to water level decline. But the 47 that were valid, they ran out of water due to high capacity pumping in the area in 2022. So this map shows the valid complaints in the dots and the not valid complaints in the X's here. And the larger circles on the map show the 1 foot area of influence for each high capacity well that we found contributed to well interference. So the pink circles show Blaine's wells area of influence. And the dashed pink circles are from that east well field, the unpermitted pumping that Blaine was doing from the east well field. So you can see that all of the valid complaints are within the pink area of influence circles. And so there were 2 other golf courses that were minor contributors, but really we found that Blaine was the main contributor in all complaints here. So all of the complaints are in these Blaine area of influences. The 2 golf courses that were minor contributors are shown in blue and green here, and they contributed to well interference in 1 complaint each, shown this blue one and this green complaint here. And you might be wondering why these wells here, these wells are, the golf course did not contribute to well interference in these 4 pink wells here. And this is because those domestic wells were installed after that water use permit for the golf course was authorized. And it's because of that Minnesota rule that we had talked about earlier. So this was it. This was our investigation. This is what we found. Blaine was the main contributor in all of the valid complaints. The 2 golf courses just were very minor contributors, but pumping by the city of Blaine was really what caused water levels to drop in 2022. So if you think back to the takeaways at the beginning of the talk, really, it was Blaine that caused Ham Lake to run out of water. And the reason for this, again, was geology. Everything is connected in this area, and there's fracture flow, meaning that drawdown can propagate across larger distances, but also that peak summer water use, both these high volumes from municipal pumping, but also from people's individual domestic use. That peak summer water use really, causes water levels to drop in this aquifer system. So we finished the investigation in May of 2023. There's a report and other materials on our website if you're interested in looking at more. But since then, we have finished the well interference settlement process for all of the 47 valid complaints. So these 47 people have been reimbursed by the city of Blaine for work they did to resolve their water supply. And you may remember that I said we received around 90 complaints total, so we still have more to investigate. And so we are continuing that investigation right now. And I am just in the process of finishing another report, a smaller report, but similar to this one, for additional complaints. And we're also, big picture long term, we're reviewing Blaine's permit to make sure that everyone's water supply is protected. We want to make sure that domestic users in Ham Lake have enough water. We also want to make sure that Blaine has enough water. So we're working on working with Blaine and Ham Lake to balance those things. So that is all I have for this talk. I would be happy to take questions. I put my contact info on here, and I also put Claudia Hochstein's contact information on here, who is the DNR well interference coordinator, and I think is also here. If you have any questions about rule or statute. So that's all I have.
Thanks, Amanda.
Yeah.
That was really, really interesting. If people have questions or things that they would like to Amanda to answer, throw those questions in the chat, and we will we can see them and get those on to Amanda. I do have one question, Amanda, to get us going while we're waiting for people to put things into the chat. I would think that there must have been some really interesting meetings with the city of Blaine after you did your investigation. Do you want to talk about how all that went?
Yeah, well, I actually was not really part of those meetings.
Hmm.
I did the report and passed it along.
Well, the reason I ask is because a lot of the evidence that you generate, and the only evidence that you can really generate to show well interference is, most of it is based on modeling. And I'm kind of curious if Blaine or another city or another owner of a high production well would look at that and say, our wells don't cause interference here. And I'm just kind of wondering, to what extent do you have to really argue that fact and the accuracy of the models to make your case?
Yeah, so what I didn't include here is that the city of Blaine does have, they had their own modeling prior to this just to, scope out their new well field and stuff because they're expanding. And so they hired a consultant to make a model, and they used a much more detailed model. So we're essentially working with Blaine and their consultant now to have them update their model to try to recreate 2022 with their model. But we did find, I did compare the two, and they're not, in terms of drawdown, they're not that different. And they're, different methods, but they're not the magnitudes of drawdown aren't that different. And so, yeah, we haven't, gotten, I guess, a lot of pushback on this model. I think also just because I feel like the model showed who is responsible, but the field data, the water use and the water level data are more compelling because those were measured in real time, and you can see that, the domestic wells water levels are following the same trends as the other wells in the area, and they correlate so well with when high water use was happening. And Blaine is just the biggest user in the area by a lot. And so I think those facts alone kind of make it just like a more airtight, I guess.
So Abby threw a comment or a question into the chat. Have any complaints from 2021 or reported later, but the issue started in 2021, been investigated yet? I remember getting calls about issues in this area back when I worked at Anoka County during that time.
Yeah. Yes. So people were having problems in 2021. There were some similarities in those problems. We have not gone through this process, the investigation process that I showed. We haven't gone through that process for the 2021 complaints because DNR got drought relief funds from the legislature for 2021. So people that had well interference issues in 2021, they could apply to the DNR to get reimbursed through those separate funds. And so they're kind of following a different process than the well interference process. And so we haven't been able to dive into those complaints because they've been covered.
Yarda asks questions, were the two minor high capacity well contributors involved in the compensation process?
They were not. Blaine, they were such small contributors that Blaine just, and those golf courses are also within the city limits of Blaine, so Blaine just reimbursed everyone. The golf courses didn't.
Shandy asked a question that actually was on my mind. Is there some sort of pre-approval review process for the wells being used prior to putting the wells in, that are receiving a permit so that they know, so they knew if they would be approved for a permit, or did they just use their own modeling?
Kind of confused about that question. Was this for the city of Blaine?
Yeah, I think
what the
question is getting at is, in other words, when you have, and Shandy, feel free to correct, but I think the question really comes down to, before a city, for example, would put in high capacity wells, is there some kind of pre-approval review process that, would say, yeah, you're good to go based on our modeling, or is it up to them to do their own modeling and, kind of make their own decision, and then if there are problems, you come after them?
I see. No, so how it happens is as soon as someone knows they're going to put in a new well, so they knew they were going to put in these wells, they submitted kind of like a preliminary application to us that said like, hey, we're going to put in these wells. And it wasn't like a real permit application. It's like a preliminary FYI. And we said, okay, like when you put them in, we need to review. Like, you need to submit an application and we need to review. And at that point, like, so they didn't submit the application, but in a normal process at that point, when someone submits an application, then we review. So yeah, we don't just like wait for problems to happen. We ideally catch them first through our review, but we just didn't get that chance this time because they didn't submit the full application to us. We just got like the FYI that this could be happening. So hopefully that answers the question.
CJC asks, put a comment in. Excellent presentation. Thank you, Amanda. Just a quick question about the involvement of Met Council, since Blaine is in Anoka County and is one of the 7 counties that Met Council water supply oversees.
Yeah, we haven't, I'm not sure if any other people who are on this project are here who have talked to Met Council, but we have not really worked with them a lot on this. Yeah,
Hmm.
I would love to, but we haven't really.
They were probably happy not to be involved, I would guess.
Yeah,
They left it to
right.
you. No, I don't know. Let's see. Another question. Have Blaine's high capacity wells altered directions of groundwater flow in the area? It's a great question.
Hmm. Um, Big picture, I'm not sure, but like locally, definitely that happens in during periods of high water use.
Hmm.
Um, yes, it will change groundwater flow locally, but like regionally on a big scale, um, I'm not sure. I haven't looked at that.
Hmm. Blaine continues. John G says Blaine continues to add new housing developments at what he terms an alarming rate. How are they going to provide water to all these new houses? And how were the unpermitted wells brought online in the first place? Another question that I had. It's interesting. I would think that um, putting unpermitted wells in would put them at some risk, right? And it would seem to get other cities' attention when this kind of thing happens.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I can't answer that. I'm not sure. Um,
Right.
I'm not sure. In terms of growth, uh, you know, Blaine does need more water, like it, you know, and that area in general is growing quickly. And so when there's more people in an area, people will need more water. So that is essentially that's our what our job is to balance that is to figure out how to get people water, with drinking water being the first priority, while also making sure there's enough water for future generations and making sure it's sustainable. And so,
Hmm.
yeah,
Amanda,
that's the tricky
do
part.
you want me to hop in on some water supply planning with that question?
Sure.
Yeah, so the Met Council and DNR both have water supply planning responsibilities. So the Met Council has to do, they handle population projections and, what the future kind of looks like in an area. And so as a city is doing that population projection planning with Met Council on a 10-year basis, we're also using the numbers that Met Council comes up with on our water supply planning side. So we're kind of getting started with a water supply planning cycle now that's going to kick in a few years here. And so at that point, once a water supply plan and the comp plan are kind of like locked in, then if the city wants to supply water for or like add another well, it really has to be tied back to that comprehensive planning. So like Met Council is kind of there to figure out if that population, like if the growth that's projected is sustainable and kind of, I don't know, provide some guardrails for that growth at that point. And we work together to figure that out. And then if it kind of guides how water permitting would happen in the future, and like have they planned for this growth, and have we determined that any additional growth wouldn't cause harm in this way. But I think one thing, Amanda, did you mention that Blaine was still within their permitted pumping quantity? It just,
Yeah.
it's not,
Well,
okay.
I
Couldn't
did not
remember.
mention that,
Okay.
but but it is true. Yeah, they're
Yes.
not using over their
Hmm.
permitted amount.
So Steve asks, can Blaine actually just drill deeper then and reduce the chances of interference. In theory, a deeper well would reduce the cone of depression and maybe some of the interference. Or is this simply an issue with the screening of the private wells being drawn below the screens?
Yeah, I don't think drilling deeper is an option here, and that's because there is no new appropriation allowed from the Mount Simon aquifer. Like the next big deepest aquifer would be the Mount Simon, and there's legislation passed that didn't allow more water use from the Mount Simon unless there was no other options for groundwater.
So that
And
kind of
so,
gets back at John's earlier comment, and he's, in question, he said, given all of this, how in the world is Blaine going to provide water to all the new homes coming online if they can't be putting in or drilling deeper these municipal wells? Does that come into this process at all? Or is that kind of like, well, that's not your problem?
yeah, I mean, so I guess I want to stress that there's not a shortage of water at this time. Um, this happened because water levels, have decreased and this drought was bad. And so there was more water use than ever, but it's not like the water in the area, groundwater is going to be gone. We're not there. Like there is a lot of water. It's access to water, the domestic wells access to water that was the issue. And so, it most of the domestic wells when they were installed, the pumps were just set at a level that used to be okay, but because of the increase, like the big seasonal declines that happened, that pump was too shallow, so they put it deeper. And so we have like guardrails in place to make sure that the aquifers are not being damaged by the water levels going so low. So the water levels have been dropping recently, but they're not to the point where the aquifer is like getting damaged or they're not dangerously low. Like this was a water access issue. But long term, like Claudia was talking about, long term planning, we do need to think about water use in this area overall because it is increasing and we need to look at it together with population
and Claudia threw something in here too to clarify. As the permitting process continues, they may need to create additional agreements with the people in Ham Lake to lower their pumps more. That was one of the questions I had too. Carl throws in the thought that, here's an unpopular opinion for you. Maybe irrigating lawns should be more regulated. So send those comments on to Carl, everybody. But yeah, right. I imagine that management of water supply is one of the big questions that comes up, right? Prioritizing water use. Other communities seem to have regulations in place for how much, and when you can water lawns and so forth. So that doesn't seem to be an outrageous kind of idea.
Yeah. I mean, depends on who you talk to. In my opinion, it's a popular opinion. Have irrigating, less irrigation of lawns, but yeah. Yep, that would definitely help.
Sherry asks, some cities are starting, there was a comment in, some cities are starting to require new developments to use stormwater for irrigation instead of groundwater, right? So maybe getting at some of that issue right there. So we are out of time, and this has been just a great presentation, Amanda, and really generated a lot of good discussion. Thanks so much for the presentation that you gave. And hopefully if people have other questions, they can contact Amanda or Claudia. I think you put into the end slide there as well. And they can give you more information. Thanks again so much.
Yeah, thanks everyone for listening.
Yeah, I really liked the way you presented